Welcome to the Ken Hill Podcast. I'm Ken Hill, and this is podcast number 81. We've had quite a bit of in-depth topics with the last podcast, so I thought we'd do something a little bit different on this one, a little bit more lighthearted, and quite the trip down memory lane. And this is something I get asked this actually quite a bit, and trust me, I get it. And once you listen to this list, you'll certainly understand how I get the whole passion for motorcycles and motorsports and gearhead and all that, because I am a total gearhead. But one of the things I've tried to work, and I've had to work hard at this. So don't think that it's something easy that just comes naturally. But you have to separate the gearhead part from the riding part. And I'm just as much a geek as anyone else, probably worse actually. When I look at new models and all the features and all the specs of the bikes, because it's something that I do as well. There's nothing more fun than some of the new models or even some of the old models. And this list here is quite the trip down memory lane. So what this list is essentially of all the bikes I've owned, or all the bikes that I've at least raced, and pretty much every bike that I've raced, I've owned, and there's a few in here that when I go through the list that I'll mention if it's one that I was riding for someone. So, all right. Let's just do it. Let's just get into this. So there's quite a few. There's 20 plus on this list. So let's just dive into it. So the first bike I ever owned, I bought brand new, was a 1993 Honda F2, and I bought it from the dealership. And it was my first bike. It was a California model, and I thought it was the fastest thing a person could ever throw their leg over. And later on, as I got into racing it, it made a whopping 77 horsepower California model F2 on Mike Canfield's dyno. And of course, I didn't know anything about the California spec versus whatever spec and different cams and all this stuff. I just knew this thing was fast. And oh my gosh, yeah, it was not. And taking this bike all through the different levels, what a disaster learning how to work on this thing, taking the emissions equipment off and updating it and figuring it all out. Raced it stock the first year. I did have a revalved rear shock from Jim Lindemann, a fork from Jim Lindemann. Otherwise, the bike was 100% stock, and we just rode the thing. It ended up losing a transmission. Had to have a new transmission put in, and a little bit of engine work done where we put 49 state cams in the thing, and it made 92 horsepower then, and I couldn't believe how fast it was at that point. So yeah, the F2 was a crazy bike for me, and that was the start of it. So as I got into the racing thing, then the second bike that I bought was a Honda Hawk, right, NT650. And I took it as a bone stock street bike and completely screwed it up. Just went nuts with everything on it. And I did race it. It was slow, stock motor, handled incredibly well. And that was one of the bikes where I spent hours and hours and hours basically screwing it up in the garage. And I ended up selling it as a race bike to somebody. I think I only raced it maybe half a year or something like that, but a little bit of a disaster there. And as I got better, Mike Canfield offered me a ride on his the only bike that ever had a name, and this bike was affectionately called the Pumpkin, and it had a pretty crazy paint job on it, and it was a Honda F2/F3 hybrid. And I raced this bike for a year, another exceptional motorcycle. I think at the time we had a Lindemann front end, and I think it had a Fox shock on it. So that was kind of a cool thing. Just that type of technology back then. Also a bike I did extremely well on. Of course, the bike was so fast for a Honda F2, F3 back then. Pretty cool. And then after that, this actually ranks right up there with one of my favorite bikes. I'll kind of hit the list up at the end. 1996 Gsxr 750. Holy crap! This thing, I can't even begin to tell you what an advancement this motorcycle was. And same thing, it was revalve front end, revalve shock. We put a pipe on it and Mike Canfield jetting with the carburetors, and that was it. I mean, it was incredible how stock we could leave this bike. I won my first AFM Formula Pacific race on this bike, and it was incredible motorcycle. It's just, yeah, everything worked really well on it. Never broke, and just worked. So much performance back in the day with that bike. After that, I took a little bit of a break from riding, and this is when I was full blown, working in the car industry. Family was coming along, so I decided I'm going to stop racing for a couple of years. And but I wanted to do track days because track days were just starting kind of then. So I bought a 1997 RF 900. And thought, yeah, I might do a little street riding on this thing and all that, do track days. I never saw the street. Put it on the track, realized what a great motor this bike had. And then I couldn't help myself. I started just enjoying my life on it, but couldn't help myself, and ended up going through this radical change on this gigantic, basically sport touring bike that I ended up racing, and came close to winning the AFM open production class on this thing. It got completely out of hand. Revalve front end, shock. I think I made my own rear sets. We did a bunch of jetting work on it. Wheels, blah. Oh my God, it was out of control. Dumbest thing I've ever done. But it was also pretty cool. So that was the RF 900. Then again, as I took a little bit of a break, and I decided in 2000 to get serious, and I ended up buying a Honda F4, and I'd done a little bit of endurance racing on a Honda Superhawk, a VTR 1000, and this was 2000, and basically this F4 again had Linneman suspension. Mike fixed the jetting issues that I inherited with the bike, and Mike had already done a bunch of development work on the VTR 1000. And yeah, these probably rank up as my favorite bikes. I could do no wrong on these bikes. I ended up winning, I think, a couple of championships on the F4, one championship at least on the VTR 1000. It was second in 750 Superbike on the VTR 1000. Yeah, could basically do no wrong on these bikes. And I remember that I just didn't touch them. Changing oil, never really resetting suspension. I just rode them, and at the time, it was surprising how fast I could go on those bikes, and it was pretty nutty. Looking back at some of the lap times that we did on those bikes, I was sponsored by Michelin at the time. Credible motorcycles, yeah. So it was a 1999 F4, and I don't remember the year of the VTR 1000. It was a 98 or 99, I think. VTR had a custom shock where we did some ride height stuff with it. Never changed springs, never did anything, just shut up and ride it, and the bikes worked. From there, I got some interest to ride an Aprilia Miele R. So I ended up buying this Miele R 2001, and incredible handling motorcycle. Actually led some Formula Pacific races on this bike. Holy crap, was it slow. It was slower than my F4 by a long shot. Always ran hot. We tried to build a motor for it. That was a gigantic disaster. Total Italian supermodel at that thing, but an incredible handling bike. Yeah, and it looked incredibly sexy. What a nice motorcycle, but very, very slow. So just like every other enthusiast in our industry, I ended up going after that with the Ducati 998R, and I raced that a little bit, and again, what a fickle motorcycle. It either worked amazing or it didn't work. And I did well actually on that bike in some of the AFM races, won a bunch of open twin races with it, and actually podiumed in Formula Pacific on that bike multiple times. But what a fickle motorcycle. Yeah, typical Ducati. Actually handled pretty well for not being all that crazy. I did have Öhlins do a custom shock for it. The front end wasn't anything fancy, but it worked incredibly well. And then, as I owned, I owned a Kawasaki dealership for about 5 years. And I kind of went through a period of obviously owning Kawasaki's and racing them, various ZX6s and ZX9s. Podiumed at AFM on the ZX9, raced the ZX6 on and off. We did a bunch of work for clients on the ZX6s, sold package deals for those bikes. Again, another really incredible bike. Turnkey. We kind of had the setup dialed on them, fork valving set up, and we knew what the shock liked on them, what they liked for a shock. What a great motorcycle. Just a super robust bike, never broke. Great bikes. Really good power on those bikes too for the time. The ZX9 was a love-hate. The biggest issue on that bike actually was weight. The motor wasn't bad. It was about 10 horsepower down on some of the Gsxrs at the time. But it made good torque. But weight was the biggest issue. So we really worked on getting the weight off that bike, and it wasn't bad. Yeah, it wasn't bad. I mean, I could race it at a pretty high level at AFM, and it wasn't a bad motorcycle at all. And some things on the bike were surprisingly stock that worked well. So the next sort of set of bikes is where we started to get pretty serious with things, and after that. Was a 2004 Gsxr 1000, and that was a great period of motorcycles for the Gsxrs. And this bike, we really stepped up our game at AFM. This also was the debut of my AMA racing, and it was pretty interesting because this bike was actually fairly embarrassingly stock. Pretty sure I had, we had just like Öhlins cartridges in the front and Öhlins shock in the rear, and just the normal bolt-on stuff. The motor was stock, and it ran really well. You know, the whole power commander remapping deal. Of course, Mike Canfield did all that work, and it ran really well. It was again a stock motor. We ended up doing some cam timing on that motor after the first part of the season, but yeah, the head had never come off that bike, and I raced that bike for a full year. Never changed the clutch. This is back when Dave Stanton and I were really battling for the #1 plate at AFM, and yeah, another. I mean, this one was close to like the all-time favorite bike because it's also one that we could kind of do no wrong on. There were times I did struggle a bit with this bike, but again, looking at the lap times. For the period, it was pretty insane how fast we were going on these things. Absolutely crazy. Very good motorcycle. Again, just incredibly stout. Pretty much could do no wrong on that bike as well. But of course, the pace was super high. From there, I got involved with Hondas. I had a dealership that wanted to help me out with some Hondas, and I ended up selling the Gsxr. And ended up going a little bit of a Honda route for a while. So I ended up with a 2005 CBR 1000 and a 2006 CBR 600. And the CBR, we tried running stock for a while, kind of stock, like super stock. And initially pretty dang quick on the bike. Super easy to ride, but it just really lacked acceleration. Stable bike, handled well, but lacked acceleration. And so we ended up having to do some motor work to that bike, and it ended up being a very good motorcycle. I ended up racing that bike in 2006 at some of the AMA races, and went really quick on it. Very quick. Actually, that year, 2006, Up until about middle of the year, a little bit past middle of the year, I was actually leading 4 classes at AFM on that, both the From the Pacific and Open Superbike, and then the 600 classes as well. Then I had a fall and screwed all that up. But yeah, that 2005 CBR 1000 was a very good bike, but same thing, right? It was to perform well, it needed a lot of trick parts, a lot of maintenance. We 8 transmissions on it. But yeah, I mean, it was a good bike, but boy, a lot of work. The 2006 CBR 600 was also an incredibly stable bike. God, it handled so well. Slow. There's a whole backstory to that on the motor work. We ended up building a motor for it. I bought a spare motor, built a motor for it, and the spare motor, or the built motor, ended up being basically slower than the stock motor. Interestingly enough, a lot of friction issues in that bike. So we ended up running a stock motor with a little bit of compression and cam timing, and that ended up being the best motor for that bike, but it was still slow. It came off a corner great, but no top end, revved really slow. Another pretty favorite bike to ride, but not necessarily to race. So pretty big transition here at this point was where coaching was starting to come into play, and I started working with some of the things on coaching. My last bike that I raced was a 2007 Gsxr 1000, and same thing, fairly stock bike. We did suspension on it. I did race it. I did a lot of R&D for Race Tech at the time on that bike, forks and shock. Raced it with revalve stock parts. Won some races on it. Massive torque off that bike. Holy smokes! I mean, just couldn't believe how much power that bike made. No electronic aids, of course. Very, very powerful bike, and very much enjoyed riding it. And I won some races on it, but it wasn't really a pleasurable bike to ride, quite honestly. Fun bike, but yeah, not that great. I ended up starting my coaching on that bike a little bit, and then realized that bike was a little bit too much, and I ended up buying a 2007 Gsxr 750 and did a lot of coaching on that bike for a few years. And same thing, that was another bike that we had it set up pretty well. Again, this is back, Mike Canfield was doing a lot of work for Valvoline and Suzuki, and we knew where the bike worked. And that same thing, I could ride that bike at a very slow pace, it worked well. I could ride it at a very high pace, it worked well. I could do 2-up rides on the bike, and it was typical Gsxr, just always worked. And yeah, that was a great bike, and I do miss that bike quite a bit. I would ride that bike today, no problem. Very, very good motorcycle. So then I started off, when I was starting a little bit more with the Yamaha school, kind of getting into Yamahas a little bit. And I bought a 2009 R1 when they came out, and I also had a 2009 R6 that I bought wrecked. The R1, I left it 100% stock. We didn't do anything to it, nothing, and I rode it, and what a beast. You know, that cross-plane motor was fun, and I did a lot of coaching on that bike and enjoyed riding it immensely. Except it was slow. Oh my gosh, was it slow. Slow and heavy. Fun bike to ride, but slow and heavy. Ironically, you know, from working with clients, I didn't really have a problem like keeping up or anything along those lines with some of the faster riders. The open tracks, I struggled with that bike. It was ironic because that was one of the best stock bikes I ever rode at Sears Point. It was a great bike at Sears Point for whatever reason. And I don't know if it was just the torque coming off the corners, but it worked really, really well at that track. And I went very, very quick on that bike for stock at Sears Point / Sonoma. And then the R6 also a great bike, 2009 R6, fairly stock as well. That was another bike that, again, could pretty much do no wrong on it. Typical R6, we did lose a motor in it. And I had that done. I rode it a bit, but for an instructor bike, it was not great because as I worked with a quicker client, trying to keep up, getting traffic, the 600s just don't work that well for it. But it was a very, very good motorcycle. And again, that bike would be extremely, extremely relevant today. So then I kind of went back on the Gsxr, the Kawasaki route, and Went with 2011 ZX10, 2012 ZX10. Did some work for Cowie, did some work for Oleans on these bikes. And again, just a really great bike that we left very, very stock. And they were what a powerful bike. Super fun. Didn't have any issues with them. Really great motorcycles, excellent motorcycles. And just again, lapdog these things. So bunch of great bikes. Kind of soulless. It's funny. I look at those bikes and I'm reading my list, and I remember riding them, and they were great, but completely nondescript. They're like, yeah, they're okay. Great motorcycles. I never had any issues with them. Responded well to changes. But yeah, there's just nothing really fancy about that. And then I went through, I wanted to try something a little bit different. And this is back, so this is when I, was riding a lot of FZ1s at the schools. So I had a school bike that I was using, and ended up, I really wanted this bike to work because I had done some development work for Buell back in the day with the 1125. And Nick Einach also had done some things for Buell, and I was just such a fan of their passion. And I bought a 2015, I think, Buell 1190 RS, and boy, did I want that bike to work. Man, did I want that bike to work. And I rode it, and I loved it. I mean, it was super fun, just telepathic, throttle to hand turned incredibly well. I never went that quick on the bike for whatever reason. And we did some fun things where we did some suspension work on it for Showa. I even tried some Öhlins parts on it as well. The brake was a big holdback on that bike for sure. Struggled with the brake. Really enjoyed that motorcycle. Was not a robust motorcycle. I had issues with electronics on it. Just not great. Boy, but man, did I want that bike to, I just wanted that bike to be really good. Fun riding it when it worked well. But not a super robust bike, unfortunately. So a quick segue into all the FZ1s that I rode, whether it was at the Yamaha school, whether it's at the Yamaha school or even the FZ10 at the Rick school. So many FZ1s. We put literally tens of thousands of miles on multiple FZ1s, and what an incredible bike. It was shocking how fast we could go on them. Bone stock on Q2s at the time. Incredible how fast we could go on these motorcycles, and they also worked. They also ended up working pretty well. I rode some modified ones at the Rick schools. They also worked well. Again, went super fast on them. The FC10 stock was not that great. It mainly, honestly, on the electronics and the suspension. Once they were modified, the bike became extremely fun to ride. I, again, put thousands and thousands and thousands of miles on the thing. Went very, very quick on that motorcycle with Q3s, Q3 Pluses at the time. And loved that bike, just loved it. But it did take quite a bit of modifications to make it work. Suspension, we ended up doing some custom ECU work on that bike, and it responded incredibly well. I mean, why, of course, why wouldn't it, based on the motor that's in the thing? But super fun bike, but did take a lot of modifications. I also had a 2016 Gsxr 1000, left it stock. It was kind of late in 2016, and rode it stock. Great bike, super powerful. It was also going to be the new 17s were coming out, so we kept this bike pretty much stock and rode it. Didn't ride it that much actually, but also a very, very fun bike. Just a huge Gsxr fan. So that kind of leads me down the pathway of where I'm at now. And where I'm at now is I have a 2018 Gsxr 1000R. I also have a 2010 Gsxr 600. We just added a 2020 ZX6 as well. And These are bikes that are all relatively stock, like the 2010 Gsxr 600. It's so slow, but handles incredibly well. It starts up every time, and it is just a very, very comfortable bike to ride, and it's just a typical Gsxr, and so it's a very, very enjoyable bike to ride. Low maintenance. Actually enjoy riding it. I enjoy riding it a lot. The 18 Gsxr 1000, also fairly stock. It has, it's funny, I wrote it stock, said I'm not going to change it. And of course, what do? Yeah, I change it. Put a pipe on it, a Graves pipe. It has a kind of a custom FT-ECU flash. Upgraded the brakes because the brakes absolutely suck on the Gsxrs. So upgraded the brakes, and that's really it. And that has been a really, really favorite bike of mine as well. I love the electronics. It is so fast. Every time I ride it, I just can't believe that you can buy something like this. Great electronics, amazing feel. I'm very, very happy with this bike, and it's honestly this Gsxr 1000 is right probably in the top 5 list of all the bikes. We also just added a 2020 Gsxr. I don't have a lot of time on that bike yet. Only ridden it a few times, and I also really, really like that bike so far. Dirt bike wise, I did have a couple of XR100s, some KLX 140s, XR 400. Put a lot of time on that, and we could talk about those forever as well. But yeah, the typical modifications of the XR 100s. Having a lot of like our kind of our own group had our own little XR 100 mods, KLX 140s. We went nuts with those. Really like those bikes as well. So yeah, a lot of motorcycles have come through my garage, and a lot of experience with that. And so yeah, kind of a little bit of a trip down memory lane. So I guess if you were to put a gun to my head, you know, I don't know if I honestly don't know if I could choose. And I think, you know, this kind of goes back to as you get older, I mean, more mature, I would probably pick, yeah, the F4, the VTR 1000, or God, I don't know, even the 96 Gsxr 750. I don't know. Those were bikes that I just could do no wrong on, and we just didn't touch them. And we went incredibly fast on those bikes. You know, some of the best, I guess, analog bikes that you could have. Incredible bikes. If we were to fast forward to now, I would definitely pick the 2018 Gsxr 1000. There may be a caveat to that later on when I get more time on the 2021 ZX10. That's not mine, but right now that is sort of at the top of my list. So. All right, there you go. A lot of motorcycles, just a little bit of a snippet on each bike, but at least that gives everybody a glimpse of the bikes that I've owned and what we did with them. And it'd be fun to do an update on this podcast in a year or so, looking at some of the more relevant bikes. And part of also this, I want to do a separate podcast on some of the cool other race bikes that I've ridden. I've got a pretty good history with riding some of the Graves bikes, and then, you know, even riding some of the Valvoline / M4 bikes. And so that there's some fun stuff that'll go along there, but we'll save that one for another podcast. So, all right, thanks for tuning in.